Welcome back to Ticket Stubs. My name is Carmilla Dumouriez, and I've got some movies on my mind. Let's talk about them. Anatomy of a Fall is a film from writer-director Justine Triet, who has done some other stuff that I've never seen or even heard of. This film won the Palme d'Or at Cannes Film Festival this year, which is the top prize. The last three winners of that award are Triangle of Sadness by Ruben Östlund, which I have not seen, Titane by Julia Ducournau, which is fantastic, and Parasite by Bong Joon-ho, which I don't need to tell you is great. So generally Palme d'Or winners are things that I'm at least interested in checking out, and usually end up being some of my favorite films of their respective years, although occasionally they are a little too slow for my tastes. And while Anatomy of a Fall is a pretty quiet, patient 2.5-hour movie, I still really enjoyed it. As the title suggests, this film centers around an investigation into the fatal fall of a man named Samuel. The fall happens off-screen, and the only witnesses present are his wife, played by Sandra Hüller, and their blind son. The investigation reveals that the fall was not an accident, and so most of the film revolves around Sandra Hüller's character, also named Sandra, in a courtroom battle to prove that she did not kill her husband, he killed himself. But it doesn't function like a typical mystery. It's very clear from the beginning that the film is not going to tell you whether or not she did it. And that's honestly one of the things that I liked the most about this film. There's such a clear and meaningful intention behind what you don't see, and coming to the understanding of why that is and what the film is going for is a much more challenging and satisfying takeaway than her guilt or innocence. It's the kind of film that says much more about the viewer than the viewer could say about the film. It's so intelligently presented and crafted to make us come to our own conclusions based on the evidence that we've seen. We are, in essence, a part of the jury here. Everything from the script to the direction to the editing to the fantastic performances is all in service of this central idea. Without spoiling anything, there's one cut during a pivotal scene that just happened at the perfect moment. It's one of several moments that I found myself consciously thinking about and appreciating the choices that were made for why something was shown the way it was. This same script shot and edited in a different way would be so much less emotionally satisfying. It's a perfect example of why how you show something is often much more important than what you're showing. Sandra Hüller's performance is nothing short of exceptional. Her character is German but moved to France to be with her husband, so she's facing a justice system that she doesn't have any experience with. And throughout the court proceedings, she's constantly shifting between English, French, and German. It's a believable, detail-oriented performance. It's fucking fantastic. I don't really know what else to say about it. Give her an Oscar. Milo Mikado Grainer plays the son, and he's also pretty fantastic. His character is very important to the film, and there wasn't a single point where I found him unbelievable. I only have a couple of nitpicks when it comes to issues. Even though it's quite well paced and I can't say I was ever bored, the 2.5-hour runtime did wear on me, and I found it quite an exhausting watch by the end. It does feel like a long movie, and I can't say that it flew by. And as intelligently and artfully presented as this film is, it doesn't entirely avoid cheesy melodrama in the courtroom scenes. There were only a few moments, but they did kind of stick out tonally. One other thing I want to mention, and this didn't really bother me, but there is a dog in the film that has something bad happen to it. That's all I can say without getting into spoiler territory, so if you need more information before you go see it, then look that up. It caused a pretty visceral reaction from my audience, so I figured I should mention it because it seemed like a lot of people were really upset about that. Anyway, I thought Anatomy of a Fall was a great film, great script, great direction, great editing, great music, great characters, great everything. Just wish it was a little bit shorter personally. I don't know that I could watch it again anytime soon, but I still think it's very, very good and you should see it. For me, it's an 8 out of 10. May December is the newest film from Todd Haynes, a director that I've been familiar with for a while, but his filmography is something of a blind spot for me. I did watch Carol on a plane when I was like 16, and I remember enjoying it quite a bit, but I haven't seen it since, so I'll need to revisit it to really make up my mind on that one. And several of his other films do intrigue me quite a bit, so I'd like to get to them soon. His newest film stars Natalie Portman as an actress who's preparing for a role in an upcoming film depicting the relationship between Gracie and Joe, played by Julianne Moore and Charles Melton, respectively. This is loosely based on the true story of Mary Kay Letourneau, a school teacher who had an affair with her 12-year-old student Billy Falau in the 90s. She gave birth to their first child while in prison, and they married when she was released. And none of that affair is actually depicted in May December. Instead, Todd Haynes forces us to sit with this bizarre situation 20 years later. Joe is now the same age that Gracie was when she molested him, and they have a family and children who are getting ready to go off to college. As Natalie Portman's character spends a week with them trying to understand Gracie and find some humanity behind this monster, sure we'll call it that, tensions rise and melodrama ensues. From a description, this sounds like it would be quite an unpleasant viewing experience, but May December is actually a very funny movie, but not in a way that's cheap or exploitative or in bad taste. The film finds humor not in spite of the situation, but because of it. It's a situation where the damage is done decades ago, and the norm has been this way for quite some time, so all we can really do is uneasily chuckle about Gracie's complete lack of self-awareness and unwillingness to take responsibility for doing something wrong, and her apparently earnest belief that she has a perfectly normal relationship. But the film is a lot more complex than that. It is a character study of all three leads. It's incredibly sensitive and empathetic to Joe's character, and it clearly understands the complexity that he is an adult, but he also was never really allowed to be a child. Simultaneously, it treats Gracie as a complex character as well. Throughout the film, Natalie Portman's character speaks to people from Gracie's past and present, and through these interviews we get a very interesting kaleidoscopic picture of who she actually is, and the circumstances that could have made her this way. And Natalie Portman's character is an interesting window into an actor's life and what it's like to get inside the mind of a character, especially one as baffling and disturbing as Gracie. And speaking of acting, that was a good segue, wasn't it? The central trio in this film is absolutely incredible. It's like a Russian nesting doll of performance. Natalie Portman is playing a character who is learning to play a character, and the character that she's learning to play is the character that Julianne Moore creates through her mannerisms. There's such beautiful coordination in between these actors that makes this a very ambitious movie performance-wise, and they all rise to the challenge. I don't think I've seen Charles Melton in anything else, and it appears he mostly just does YA and like Riverdale, so it's incredibly impressive to see him pull off this character, and he really has a lot to work with. He fully embodies his character and is given several scenes to really show his emotional muscles, including one on the rooftop of the house that is genuinely hysterical and I couldn't stop laughing. And even within this scene, it continually oscillates between funny and genuinely heartbreaking. And while all three leads are fantastic, if this is the favorite, Julianne Moore is Olivia Colman. This is one of my favorite performances I've seen all year and one of my favorite performances in recent memory. There's no face-changing makeup or anything, but she completely disappears into this character. All of her mannerisms are so carefully chosen and consistent, which makes it even more impressive when Natalie Portman is able to pick up on it too. It's an incredibly symbiotic performance, and if she wasn't up to the other cast members, then it absolutely would not have worked. Gracie is by turns despicable, pitiful, likable, intimidating, vulnerable, fragile, powerful, and childlike at times. She's an emotional time bomb, and it's always a joy to watch her on screen. Even though this film has a very disturbing core, I was still smiling through a vast majority of it. It was just such a riot. It really helps that the tone is communicated so well through the score by Marcelo Zarvos. It's essentially a theme and variations on Michel Legrand's score for The Go-Between, and I could really feel the composer having fun with manipulating this melody and just constantly using the same harmonic sequence that's incredibly striking and melodramatic. The score is in perfect symbiosis with the film and immediately lets you know what to expect. This is not a thriller or a horror. There is no explosion of violence, just a constantly escalating tension. It's a dark comedy and a character study with one of the best screenplays of the year in my opinion. I fucking loved May December. It's on Netflix right now, so go watch it. It's a blast. And I'm gonna give May December a 9 out of 10. Thank you very much, Todd Haynes. I also saw Dream Scenario, directed by Christopher Borgli. This is his third feature, with the last being Sick of Myself, a very entertaining and intelligent film that I very much recommend. Dream Scenario stars Nicolas Cage as a shy, neurotic professor who starts appearing in everyone's dreams, even strangers. He becomes an overnight celebrity, but doesn't really care about that and just wants to get his book about ants published. I don't want to give anything else away about the plot, because this is the type of film that starts with a really intriguing premise and takes it as far as it can go. This film is first and foremost a surreal comedy, but it's not afraid to take detours into other genres as well. Without spoiling anything, there are scenes in this film that are just straight up horror set pieces. It will shift tone and genre abruptly, just like a dream. And the dream scenarios in this film are really creative and entertaining. Often very funny, sometimes scary, sometimes just fucking weird. The performances are all pretty great, and it's a really fun movie for spotting actors if you like that sort of thing. It actually has quite a large cast and changes location frequently. It's a film that constantly feels fresh and like it's presenting new things to the viewer. It's only an hour and 40 minutes, and it accomplishes so much in that time without overstaying its welcome. It's an extremely entertaining film, but it also left me with a lot of thematic stuff to chew on. This is, I think, fundamentally a film about the trajectory of fame, and it inevitably deals with contemporary themes that go along with that. Yes, this film is a dreaded commentary on cancel culture, and I have seen some backlash against the stance that this film takes, but I think it's mostly coming from the kind of person who thinks that cancel culture is not a real thing, and that every time somebody gets bullied off of a platform, they were a monster and they deserved it. Sorry, that's not the reality that we live in. We do have a lot of power when we publicly shame people, and it has happened many times that it's been weaponized against rivals within communities. I have seen this happen firsthand to queer people of color earnestly trying their best who have been ostracized, verbally abused, and shunned by their own communities, and often mostly by white people trying to prove that they're the most woke. So personally, I didn't think that this film had a very radical stance at all, and I actually found it quite balanced. The film acknowledges the reality of trauma and pain that can be inflicted by unintentional actions, while also making time to explore the trauma and pain that can come from being treated like a supervillain. This film ended up being a lot more emotionally satisfying and impactful than I expected it to. In the final scene, I was genuinely on the verge of tears. It's a perfect moment of reincorporation that's beautiful and tender and heartfelt, and it really hit home that I did care about these characters. Honestly, I don't really have anything else to say about Dream Scenario. It's a really fantastic film that goes so far with its concept, and I found it so satisfying and so much fun. I've been waffling between an 8 and a 9 on this one, but you know what, fuck it, talking about it made me remember how much I loved it, so yeah, 9 out of 10 for Dream Scenario. Alright, let's talk about Saltburn. Saltburn is the second feature from director Emerald Fennell, who made 2020's Promising Young Woman. That film was incredibly divisive, and I am coming forward to say that I didn't really like it all that much, but I didn't hate it either. I do share pretty much all the same criticisms that most people do. It's pretty toothless, and the ending is fucking awful. Carey Mulligan's great, the film looks great, and it has an important message. It's just not communicated well, and I don't think she's a particularly strong screenwriter. So I was cautiously curious about Saltburn, even though the trailer kind of made me feel like I would walk out hating it. And while there are certainly things in Saltburn that I did hate, this film was such an unforgettable experience that in some ways I kind of loved it. There are many, many problems with this film, entirely from a screenplay standpoint, but I did find it an obvious improvement from Promising Young Woman. The film follows Barry Keoghan, a poor student who's gotten into Harvard on scholarship, who's trying to worm his way into the posh circle led by Jacob Elordi's Felix. Once he has succeeded in this, he is invited to stay with Felix's family at their estate Saltburn, and one by one, Barry Keoghan's character worms his way into the hearts of the family and Saltburn itself. Emerald Fennell describes this as an erotic comedy, and I think that's a pretty apt description, although there is kind of a mystery mystery thriller element as well. This movie is horny. For the first half hour or so, I have to admit I kind of was hating it. The characters are, by design, pretty insufferable, and goddammit, I felt like I was being queer-baited for the first half hour of this movie. Too much straight sex was happening. But then about a half hour in, or somewhere around there, this movie's kind of weirdly structured, so it's hard to tell where you are in the runtime at any given moment. There was one scene that completely won me over, and for the next hour, I was having the time of my life. There are several touchstone scenes in this film that get progressively more insane and taboo-breaking, culminating in a sequence near the end that made me think, is he... oh, they are doing that. Oh my god, you're showing me this. My mouth was agape and I was overjoyed thinking about how mad that would make some people. Honestly, because of one thing that's left in frame. I would honestly hang a giant print of that scene in my living room. And I'm not giving any specifics because you will know it when you see it. This is what I respect most about Saltburn. While Promising Young Woman was incredibly toothless and sold itself as a hardcore thriller about murdering rapists, Saltburn promises a dizzying erotic thriller, and that's what you get. However, there is still an entire film built around these few scenes, and it wasn't always working for me. Bizarrely, the screenplay is occasionally really well written, but some of the dialogue is truly awful. There were many scenes, particularly in the first and last section of the film, that had me rolling my eyes and praying for the sweet release of death. But there were also so many scenes that I genuinely loved. The score is exceptional and versatile. There are some modern-sounding electronic tracks, while also including grand retro orchestral and choral tracks. It appropriately highlights the film's marriage of modern sensibilities towards character and storytelling with the framework of a gothic melodrama. But some of the choices when it came to the licensed music I thought were really off the mark and kinda took me out of the film. Keep in mind, though, that I am a composer and I do have a music degree, so I pay a lot of attention to score and music choices in film, and if you liked the music choices, that's totally fine. I'm not saying you shouldn't. Just some of the pop songs were a little too on the nose for me. Where the film is consistently strong is in the visual language and the performances. Barry Keoghan continues to impress me in everything he's in. He's an incredible versatile actor, and this is a very brave performance. He's extraordinary and asked to do things that many actors would probably refuse to do. And if he gets an Oscar for this movie, I will not be mad in the slightest. Jacob Elordi does a pretty great job playing the confident yet careless Felix. There's a natural ease to his sexuality that's absolutely called for by the character. And god, does he look good with an eyebrow piercing. Rosamund Pike kills it as always. She's absolutely fucking hilarious in this film. Richard E. Grant was a blast to watch in every scene, and even though Carey Mulligan has very little screen time in the film, every line that came out of her mouth made me laugh out loud. It's a pretty big cast and they all do a pretty great job, so I'm not really gonna single anyone else out, except for Archie Madikwe because he's fucking hot. A lot of eye candy for the gays in this one. Alright, I'm trying not to spend too long on each film, so let's wrap this up. It's been a while since I've been this conflicted on a film, and it's mostly because this is a film of extremes. I was either loving it or tearing my hair out. It probably does deserve a lower rating than the one that I'm gonna give it, but what I personally look for in a film is something that unapologetically itself and bold. And Saltburn really did tick that box for me. Warts and all, it is an unforgettable film. I'd rather have a film that bounces between wild extremes than one that's consistently okay throughout its runtime. And I just gotta respect Emerald Fennell for showing us with this film that she has big, veiny, dangling balls. So, against my better judgment, I'm gonna give Saltburn an 8 out of 10. Alright, it's time for Godzilla -1. This is the first Godzilla film to be made in Japan since 2016's Shin Godzilla, a film I found quite memorable, largely owing to a very unique and fresh take on the design of the titular creature. But unfortunately, I think it just overstays its welcome at 2 hours and spends way too much time on a very boring human story. An improper balance of human drama to monster fightin' is almost always the downfall of one of these movies. So when tons of people told me that Godzilla Minus One was a masterpiece, and that the human story is just as engaging as the monster action, I was skeptical but optimistic. And for the first hour or so of this film, I am in total agreement. The first half, and even possibly the first 2/3 of Godzilla Minus One, honestly feel like they have more in common with something like Kurosawa than a traditional Godzilla movie. The film is set at the end of World War II, and the main character is a kamikaze pilot who, at the beginning, sort of fakes that his plane has something wrong with it and lands on an island that is being used by the Japanese military to repair broken kamikaze planes. So naturally, the engineers find that there's nothing wrong with the plane, and he's essentially treated as a deserter. And then Godzilla attacks and kills all but the main character and one other person on the island. And there's this immediate juxtaposition with Koichi, the main character, essentially being told he's responsible for the deaths of all of these men. And then when he returns to a decimated Tokyo, he's seen as responsible for the loss of the war because he didn't do his duty. And all of that is compounded with the PTSD of seeing people be eaten by a giant monster. One of the most admirable qualities of this film is how it returns to the original idea of Godzilla as a metaphor for nuclear war. Of the Godzilla films I've seen, this one certainly puts the most effort into recapturing the dour tone of the original, and it partially does this by reusing the skeleton of the original. In this film, Godzilla isn't the man in a rubber suit doing a victory dance when he beats another man in a rubber suit, but a genuinely intimidating force of destruction. Which is a good segue into discussing the actual Godzilla action, and it's pretty awesome for the most part. This film's budget is minuscule, especially in comparison to the American Godzilla movies that have been made in recent years, but a good director and art department can turn limitation into creativity. There are only a couple of major Godzilla set pieces in the film, but it's so clear that that's where most of the budget went. They certainly went with the show it less and make sure it looks good approach. And Godzilla looks really great, even though there's not as much expression as a fully rendered CG model might be. His arms never really move, his eyes don't blink, and his mouth seems to have only just up and down motion, but it kind of adds a little bit of uncanny terror to it. There is an incredible and very long sequence of Godzilla chasing a very small fishing boat, and aquatic stuff more than anything can just terrify me, and watching Godzilla's unblinking, smiling face leisurely chasing this boat was genuinely horrifying to me. There's also an incredible sequence of mainland destruction where the score and sound design is perfect and beautifully heightens the apocalyptic tone, and this sequence also ends on an incredibly powerful note. But unfortunately, this sequence was the last time in the film that I felt a sense of awe, and this is the point at which I'm gonna start pissing off the Godzilla Minus One fans, so please do recall that I spent the last 4 minutes talking about how much I loved the first 2/3 of this movie. The last act really did leave me feeling kind of disappointed, to be honest. There's a stretch of what felt like 45 minutes to an hour where Godzilla does not show up and it just painfully sets up the climax. I think part of the issue is that I have seen the original and I remember the climax of the original, so when they reveal their plan to defeat Godzilla, I did smile because it felt like a nice little nod, but the time spent between introducing and implementing the plan is just so stretched out and boring. It feels like it just goes through a checklist of things that need to happen before we get to that point, but it just wasn't doing it in a way that I found interesting. With the exception of a very clever letter that the main character writes, I liked that reveal quite a bit. And then there are a couple of setups where the film telegraphs what's going to happen by trying to hide it. There's a cut mid-sentence that by trying to conceal information, the film actually reveals it, and it's supposed to be a big surprise at the end. And there is a very clear alternative to how it could have been done that I would have preferred, but that's not really a strike against the film, just my personal preference. I think it would have made more character sense and would have been more dramatically satisfying, but whatever. And unfortunately, the last Godzilla showdown is the least impressive in the film, so it really does feel like it peters out. Their plan to defeat Godzilla is so preposterous that it was even difficult for me to suspend my disbelief in this movie about a giant atomic lizard. And then there's the ending, which I won't spoil, but I will say that I wanted to stand up and boo. To be clear, I'm not talking about the last shot, I did like that, but I'm talking about the conclusion of the human story. I understand why this film ends in the way that it does, and many people I've talked to did not have a problem with it. So again, this is a personal preference thing and my personal issue with the movie. I'm not trying to argue that this is some objective fault or anything. It's just my opinion, okay? Can you tell I'm a little scared of the fans of this movie? So it's very clear to me that what this film is going for thematically is a reflection on Japan's attitude towards the value of life during World War II. I think this is very obvious from the fact that it follows a kamikaze pilot who's treated by everyone he comes across as a disgrace for still being alive. And so I understand why the film would maybe want to end with a sort of celebration of life. But the way it's done here made me feel cheated by the film. In order to reach this ending, it has to undermine many of its boldest and best choices from earlier in the film. So it kind of cancels out those choices in my view. And yes, I am partially biased for preferring darker fare in my fiction and film, but the reason that it was so frustrating was that it felt like the film tried to give me that and then undercut it by the end. I wouldn't have an issue with this ending if it was properly set up and fit better in the context of the rest of the film. But I'm going over time and I need to move on to the next film, so let's wrap this up. In spite of my issues with the last act, I really enjoyed Godzilla Minus One. It would have been better if it was 90 minutes, that's my feeling on pretty much every Godzilla film. So it's not a 10 out of 10 best of the year masterpiece for me, but it is one of the better Godzilla films for sure, and I will say that I feel great about its success. So even if I may not be as enthusiastic about it as other people, please don't take that as an indication that I think my taste is above other people's. It's just that this film didn't quite meet my tastes all the way through, and that's okay, and I'm super happy for people who love it. I do love it to some extent, but I do have quite a few issues with it, and I don't know that I would watch it again. And I'm gonna give Godzilla Minus One a 7 out of 10, which, may I remind you, is a positive rating. Okay, let's move on. And the final film I saw in 2023 was Poor Things. This is the newest film from Greek director Yorgos Lanthimos, whose incredible films include The Favorite, The Lobster, and The Killing of a Sacred Deer. I've not yet seen Dogtooth or Alps, but they are on my watch list. The Favorite in particular I consider to be one of the absolute best films of the 2010s. That film was his first collaboration with screenwriter Tony McNamara and actress Emma Stone, both of whom return for Poor Things. This is based on the award-winning novel by Scottish writer Alistair Gray, which weaves together found documents and competing narrators to tell the surreal story of Bella Baxter, a young Victorian woman who's been reanimated by mad scientist Godwin Baxter after taking her own life. After seeing Poor Things 3 times already, I can confidently say that it is my favorite of Yorgos Lanthimos' films, and in the same way that The Favorite was a defining film for the 2010s, I think Poor Things will go down as a landmark of 2020s cinema. This film is simply incredible. From the moment it began, I could tell that this was going to be something special. It certainly invokes Frankenstein and the horror films of the 30s, with an icy 4-note motif played high on the violin, stunning black and white cinematography, Bella's childlike mashing of piano keys, and then the striking image of Godwin's patchwork face. This appropriately communicates the dark and horrific undertones that the film will certainly bring out, but this gothic brooding opening is just a launch pad. And from here, the sheer breadth of emotions and themes that the film manages to expertly weave together is simply breathtaking. This film is deeply uncomfortable, consistently laugh-out-loud funny, moving and endearing and joyful. When the film begins, Bella essentially has the brain of an infant, and we gradually watch her learn and grow and think and feel and experience and mold herself unapologetically into the person that she wants to be, never once accepting things just because that's the way they are. Bella Baxter is one of the most endearing and enjoyable characters to spend time with that I've encountered in a long while, and it all rests on Emma Stone's performance, which in my opinion is a career best for her. This is an incredibly challenging role that she navigates deftly. It so easily could have fallen into the realm of tasteless parody of mental illness, but the way she's able to convey her mental progression through her physical performance, first of all, impressive as fuck, and second of all, seems deliberately calculated to avoid ableism. In fact, you can very easily read this film through an autistic lens, and in that regard, it comes across very compassionate and empathetic, and honestly, Kinda relatable. And while Emma Stone in many ways carries this film, every other actor is also fantastic as well. Willem Dafoe is my favorite actor, and his performance as Godwin Baxter is nothing short of incredible. He takes a morbid character with a deeply disturbing past and manages to make him both one of the funniest characters in the film, but also one of the most heartfelt and endearing. He gets some of the best lines in the film, and you can tell that he really relished them. The intricate makeup on him is also flawless and so fucking impressive, and often shown in extreme close-up, which is always a bold move but really paid off here. Rami Youssef gives a great comedic performance and also has his moments of endearing awkwardness. There are honestly too many great performances in this film to count, and many of them don't get a whole lot of screen time, but every single character is extremely fun and extremely memorable and very well performed. One other performance that needs to be mentioned, though, is Mark Ruffalo. This performance is extraordinary. It's almost a bad performance, which is honestly kind of genius because the character is essentially giving a terrible performance that everyone sees through. It's so over the top in the funnest way possible. The tone and atmosphere of this film is also just so beautifully communicated. It is one of the most gorgeous looking films I've ever seen. The choice to use this steampunk fantasy aesthetic for 19th century Europe would ordinarily put me off. I usually don't really like quirkiness for the sake of quirkiness, but here there's such a clear thematic reason for why the world looks the way it does. The rather reductive reason is that we are seeing a world through the eyes of a child, and so because the audience is seeing sights we've never seen before, we're able to better empathize with Bella, who's doing the same, and this would be absent if it was a traditional period piece like The Favorite. And one of the aspects of this film that brings it to life the most is the score by Jerskin Fendrix. I very rarely use this word to describe art, but I genuinely feel that the score in this film is perfect. This is the composer's first film score. He's a classically trained composer who I think previously wrote like an experimental opera, which is cool. I am also a classically trained composer, so I have some authority to say that this score is perfect, and if you don't think so, you're wrong, and I have a degree to back it up, so fuck you. To get into some musical analysis to explain why the score feels so unique, he does some very smart things with orchestration here. In the beginning, as Bella is uncoordinated and clunky in her movements and speech, he'll do things like take a harp melody and process it in a way that a harp could never play, adding pitch bends which sound utterly surreal on harp. There are some tracks that use very exposed oboe playing in an extremely high range, which is pretty unusual because it's deeply abrasive and uncomfortable to listen to. But the score also changes with the trajectory of Bella's character. By the end, the music is communicating emotions that we're a little bit more familiar with, but it still does so in a way that's incredibly well composed and unique. There's one theme in particular that's introduced late in the film as a bassoon trio, I think? I'm pretty sure it's two bassoons and a contrabassoon, and it is just gorgeous and so melancholy and moving, and I cannot stop listening to it. And then this same theme is played over the credits, but in a much grander way with full orchestra and voice, and it's just magical. I cannot describe it any other way. This is actually the first film that Yorgos Lanthimos has commissioned a score for. In the past, he's used pre-existing classical music, which usually works incredibly well for his style, but it was such an important choice to go with original music for this particular film, and it's already joined a handful of films like Her, The Lighthouse, and Fantastic Planet as a score that, when listened to on its own, instantly puts me in the world of the film. I cannot imagine this film with any other music. It's just stunning. I'm thrilled that the Oscars has actually paid attention to this film, as I was worried it was a little bit too out there for the Academy. I am a little annoyed that Willem Dafoe was snubbed for Best Supporting Actor, but that's partially because I still haven't gotten over the fact that he wasn't nominated for The Lighthouse in 2019. But I am happy that Mark Ruffalo is representing this film in the Supporting Actor category because he really does deserve it. It's a fabulous performance. Poor Things is one of those once every few years kinds of great movies where every single aspect of the production comes together so beautifully to create a work of art that's moving and original and just batshit insane. I love absolutely everything about it, and it should come as no shock that I'm gonna give Poor Things a 10 out of 10.